Well, folks, thanks for being here. This is lesson 7 of our biblical studies playlist, where I teach you the basics of how to study the Bible, the basics of biblical understanding. And this lesson is dedicated to the genre of gospel or the gospels and parables. Here's something I've realized over the years is that quite often parables are misunderstood and then mistaught, and people apply parables in all sorts of ways that they're not supposed to be. And particularly that's the reason why I've included parables into this, but also one of the other reasons is that most of the parables that we see in the New Testament are actually found in the Gospels. So, again, whatever we read, whenever we read the Bible, we always want to ask the question of, what is it actually that we are reading, right? Like, what are we paying attention to? What is it that is the guiding force of our understanding of the biblical text? And again, this shouldn't be a complicated question, but it is. For some at least. And so maybe there's two categories of individuals. The underinformed being individuals who just kind of don't know what they're reading, and then they like to read it and then kind of pontificate on it. The overinformed, where I would say overcomplicate matters and end up in a place where it has nothing to do with what actually the Bible's teaching or the biblical text is teaching. So there's two categories. And it's kind of the Goldilocks idea is that for me and my perspective, just be well informed enough where you don't have the habit of overcomplicating things, and then well informed enough where you're not ignorant on the subjects that you're reading. So let's jump into it. This should be pretty quick as we run through it. What are we looking at when we look at the Gospels? Again, when we look at the Gospels, we might want to start with the idea of like what gospel even means. This might be very obvious to some, but it's not really that obvious for most people who are biblically illiterate. And I mean that in the sense that people who just haven't read the Bible, they're not concerned about those questions. We are living in a post-Christian world from my perspective, so I expect quite a bit of people to be uninformed about what the Bible actually is and what it teaches. For example, we've covered, and we'll continue to cover, but we covered the Old Testament genres, not all of them, but the major ones. And very often people don't even know what Old Testament means, right? And they don't know what Testament means. Well, Testament means covenant, so that's the Old Covenant. This is the New Covenant. Now, we've jumped into the New Covenant, and then we're confronted with 4 books telling the same story, essentially. So some people might be like, well, why is that? Why is that the case, right? Why do we have the same story from 4 different perspectives? And then these things are called the Gospels. Well, gospel, it means good news, very simply. It comes from the Greek word evangelion, and it means good news. Think about it being this. In the ancient world, suppose a king went out and fought a war and then won the war, and then there would be a heralder of the good news that the war's been won that would rush ahead into the city, into the capital, you could say, and spread the good news, right? This evangelion, this good news that the king has won the war, or any such good news, right? A prince has been born or something like that. These all would be that. Now, this is directly, you could say, tied into the message that Jesus preached. The message Jesus preached was the gospel. It was the good news of the kingdom of God. And so we have, based on that, the Gospels. Here's what I'm not going to do in this series. I'm not going to give a breakdown as to why the Gospels are trustworthy, why they're accurate, why I'm not going to go into any of that stuff. My goal here is to deal with the subject of understanding the literature. And I think predominantly, regardless of what your view is on those other subjects, it doesn't change your interpretive habits of understanding what the text is actually saying. So historical reliability and all that stuff is important, but we're not focusing on that. Those would be more apologetic subjects. The subject that we're dealing with has to do with more of a biblical study subject, right? So we're dealing with how to understand what you're reading. So what are the Gospels, right? Is it just history? Is it just narrative, right? The Gospels are not just history or narrative. Look at that first slide. Quite often people think when they're reading the Gospels, they're just reading a narrative or they're just reading history. Or some people would just say that they're reading biographies. And you'd be surprised that there are multiple views on this. There's a disagreement, you could say, on this subject. So I would say that the Gospels are not just history or narrative, but include those genres. And they include a bunch of other stuff, as a matter of fact. The Gospels are aiming at telling us the story of Jesus in a certain context to a certain audience. The audience changes from one gospel to another gospel. And so this might be the reason why we had 4 Gospels, because the authors were writing the story of Jesus to 4 different crowds of people, 4 different kinds of people. And therefore, as a result, we have 4 that we find in our Bibles. And so, is it history? Well, no, but it includes history. Is it a narrative, right? So the difference here would be, is it history like the book of Acts is history? Or is it narrative like, say, Genesis is narrative? Is it a biography? Is it just the telling of a famous person's life? And there's a bunch of other ideas out there as to what it could be. And I would just say it's not any one of these things, right? I would put the Gospels as their own genre. I would just call it Gospels. It's the genre of Gospels. It seems to me that the disciples that wrote it took aspects. They took aspects of different genres that were popular in their world and time, and then wrote this. Now, I'll try to hint at as to how some of this stuff works, right? Like thematic writing, for example. So the Gospels are not written chronologically. Luke is, but even Luke's chronological writing of the text, it doesn't include everything that Jesus did. So therefore, Luke had to pick what he thought was most important to be in the text to tell the story that he was telling about Jesus, right? So that's very important to realize. So the Gospels are also not just sayings. They are not just sayings of Jesus, right? Saying of this wise teacher or something like that. But they include short sayings of Jesus. Those short sayings are always part of the larger context of the story that is being told. So here's the way we would put this, and we'll look at some layers of audience. But one of the ways is that Jesus says a story, say, Jesus speaks to a bunch of Pharisees. It could be the case that the gospel writers will take that and then rework it into their narrative to the audience that they're writing to. Suppose like Luke, let's just say he's writing to Theophilus, and so he puts it in that context, and then there might be crossovers, like Matthew and Mark might be putting it in different places or the same place. They have a reason for why they're doing what they're doing. So you might want to ask, that's another layered kind of question as to understanding the Gospels. So always ask yourself why the Holy Spirit, through the authors, chose to include those short sayings and not others, because Jesus presumably probably said a lot of other things. I mean, the text says, John, I believe, says that if we wrote down everything that Jesus did, we wouldn't have enough books. And so there's quite a bit of things that could be included in there that aren't included in there. And that's an important question to ask. And then to ask why. Now, if you're a Christian, you believe the Holy Spirit guided this entire process, why the Holy Spirit included that stuff. If you're not a Christian, you could still ask the question as to why the authors chose to put it there. Those things aren't necessarily mutually exclusive. So, what are the Gospels, right? Like I said, I think they're just a genre of Gospels. Here's what we're looking at. The reader of the Gospels should understand the historical context of the first century. So you have to have some historical background. If you have zero historical background, you probably understand surface level stuff, but there's probably quite a bit of stuff that you could miss. That's important to realize, kind of a self-analysis of, hey, I might be wrong about these things just for the fact of me not being well informed on social customs. And I'm actually going to use a parable to show that if people aren't aware of it, then they're going to miss something important in this text. So there could be a number of different contexts included in the simple reading of the Gospels. Say you're reading the Gospel of Mark, and the context matters, right? How does it matter? Like this. I had a professor in Bible college who would say, when you're reading the Bible, it's very much like realty, in that in realty, it's location, location, location. In the Bible, it's context, context, context. And that's a very good way of remembering it. The reason why I like that is because location, location, location has to do with a physical location of where a house is or a building is. In the Bible, when you say context, 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 that's a location. So it could be the historical context. It could be the literary context. It could be where it is physically, like in the story. Is it in the beginning? Is it in the middle? Is it at the end? What's surrounding it? What comes before and after? All of that matters because especially in the case of the ones that aren't chronological, they get to arrange it however they want. And again, you want to figure out, as a good interpreter of the Bible, you want to figure out why include this story with these stories versus somewhere else, right? Especially if you have another gospel that has it somewhere else. So, for example, there's a context in which Jesus is speaking within the Gospels. That's a context. We're going to see today in one of the parables, it begins with a religious leader asking Jesus a question, and then Jesus responds to that individual. So that's like level one, you could say, of Jesus speaking to this individual. That's a historical event that took place. Jesus is responding to a question that is asked of him. Should we pay taxes to Caesar? There's a whole historical context there, right? Like you have to know that the Jews are being oppressed by the Romans. Taxation is supporting the Roman oppression, and there's internal political turmoil in Israel, and everybody's not in agreement as to whether you should pay taxes or not. So it's a loaded question Jesus gets asked. Jesus answers that question. And that's level one, you could say. And these aren't in no particular like importance kind of issues. It's surface level kind of stuff. Number two, second, the context of the author is writing in. Okay, so the author takes that story, say Mark takes that story, and then includes it in his gospel to a certain audience that's not necessarily asking that same question. I hope you guys see that. The Pharisee asks that question, or the Sadducee, or the Herodian, or whatever like that. But it's not necessarily the case that the audience of Mark is asking that question. But Mark is using that story to tell something about Jesus, not only just a recording of things Jesus did. And so you might want to ask, well, why is Mark including this story to these people he's writing to? Must have a reason for it, must be important. And then the third thing here is the historical context of the people reading the text. That's us. As a matter of fact, that is every single person who's read the Bible that is not a part of that original audience of, say, Mark. So the reason why I didn't say us in this is because the historical context of the people reading this text changes and has changed for the past 2,000 years. You have different cultures. You have different languages that are reading this. You have different kinds of people. You have different geographical locations, different understanding, different religious backgrounds. All of that is included in there, you guys. And so we might want to ask like where we are and whether we're asking those same questions or not, because one of the things we don't want to do is read our own kind of presuppositions into the text and make the text say something that it's not saying, right? That would be what's called eisegesis. So we want to understand the original audience or the original audiences. I'm completely fine saying that, and interpret it properly. So there's also the situation of the literary context, which is something I just mentioned, right? And so just the overview this, the chronological order that's in Luke and none of the other Gospels have stories within them that have been picked. And not all stories have been picked. Some have been left out. Okay. Why include them in the particular orders? And I think this is the reason why I wouldn't just say this is a biography, because now the writers of the Gospels are using these stories to tell a story. Now, the story they're telling, I would say it's all the gospel, it's all the good news, it's all the story of Jesus, but to different audiences that have different kinds of questions. So you might want to think about the reason Matthew writes, and his focus is on Jewish people understanding that this is the Messiah, and that's why Matthew has a genealogy. And that's why Matthew has a genealogy that goes back to Abraham, and that's it. And then you read Luke, and Luke's genealogy goes all the way to Adam. And Luke is giving a more linear kind of understanding of what's going on with the person of Jesus. And John is highly theological, where John starts off his gospel by saying, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and the Word became flesh. So people used to think that Mark was short because it was kind of written in haste. Nowadays, most scholars actually don't agree with that. They think there's a reason and a purpose as to why there's a hastiness to the way Mark is. And so that again goes back to kind of the encouragement, the reason why they're doing it, and for whom they're doing it. So let's jump into parables here, because parables are all over the Gospels. What are parables, man? Right? What the heck are parables? Here's what parables are. Parables are short stories that intend to have a specific teaching. A lot of scholars would say most parables, if not all parables, just have one teaching. Which means if you read a parable and you interpret it like 8 different ways, you've missed something. Okay? You've missed something there. Number 2, parables usually have 1, 2, or 3 main characters. And sometimes these characters matter because they're analogous. Sometimes these parables do not matter. They're just characters in a story to make the story rich. Okay? Number 3, parables are not allegories. Do not immediately go into reading a parable from an allegorical perspective. You're going to mess it up. We're going to look at an example of that soon. But there are some parables that have allegories within them. So, for example, the parable of the lost sons. That is commonly referred to as the parable of the prodigal son. It would be a lot better if we titled that as the parable of the prodigal sons. Both sons are lost. And I would even include it. I would even include and think that that entire text, that entire section, should be something like the parable of the lost things. Because in that story that Jesus gives, there's a coin that's lost, there's a sheep that's lost, and then there's 2 sons that are lost. I would think that's a way better way of titling that. The parable or the story of lost things includes all the lost things in that and looks at the story as one rather than 3 different stories. So it's one story about lost stuff, but it has 3 parts. And if you view it like that and understand what Jesus is actually doing with those stories, you're just blown away. It's phenomenal. So in regards to authorship, again, I'm not going to kind of go deep into the apologetic kind of arguments for authorship in regards to Mark, Luke, John, and Matthew. But I don't have any reason to doubt that Mark, the oldest account that we have is that Mark is written by Peter's dictations or Peter's notes, but the influence is definitely Peter. And I'm okay with that. I think that's completely fine. Now, here's what we're going to do. We're going to look at Augustine. This is nothing against Augustine, but we're going to look at Augustine's commentary on the Good Samaritan, and then I'm going to show you guys why this is probably the worst way to interpret the parable of the Good Samaritan, and how if he had used what I'm talking about, he would have actually not done this. And you've probably heard stuff like this from preachers, and they are wrong for doing it unless they have reason to do it. And I'll give you guys maybe a couple of notes as to how to recognize some of that stuff. Okay, so here's and then we'll read the Good Samaritan story after this. A certain man went down from Jerusalem to Jericho. This is going through his commentary. Augustine says this is Adam. Adam himself is meant. Jerusalem is the heavenly city of peace, from whose blessedness Adam fell. Jericho means the moon and signifies our mortality, because it is born, waxes, wanes, and dies. Thieves are the devil and his angels, who stripped him, namely of his immortality, and beat him by persuading him to sin, and left him half dead, because in so far as man can understand and know God, he lives, but in so far as he is wasted and oppressed by sin, he is dead. He is therefore called half dead. The priest and the Levite who saw him and passed by signify the priesthood and the ministry of the Old Testament, which could profit nothing for salvation. Samaritan means guardian, and therefore the Lord himself is signified by this name. The binding of the wounds is the restraint of sin. Oil is the comfort of good hope. Wine the exhortation to hope with fervent spirit. The beast is the flesh in which he deigned to come to us. The being set upon the beast is belief in the incarnation of Christ. The inn is the church, where travelers returning to their heavenly country are refreshed after pilgrimage. The marrow is after the resurrection of the Lord. The 2 pence are either the 2 precepts of love or the promise of this life and of that which is to come. I love that he just, in that section, he goes, it's either this or that, right? The innkeeper is the Apostle Paul. The supererogatory payment is either his counsel of celibacy or the fact that he worked with his own hands, lest he should be a burden to any of the weaker brethren when the gospel was new, though it was lawful for him to live by the gospel. This is Augustine's commentary on it. Look, man, if Augustine was preaching this in a church, I'd give this a 0 out of 10 sermon. If I went to a church service and they did this to the Good Samaritan story, this is a 0. This is a negative 10 out of 10. This is horrendous. Why is it bad? Because it doesn't do justice to the text. So let's look at the text. Here's what the text says. It says, and behold, a lawyer stood up to put him to the test, saying, so this is a context question. This is a historical context. It's a literary context. It's the context of why Jesus tells the story he says. Jesus' story about the Good Samaritan is an answer to a question. So what he said, what Augustine said, doesn't answer this question, which means Jesus never meant this. What Jesus says has to be within the context of answering this question. Or there's another question that comes up a little later, right? So he says, teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life? And he said to him, this is Jesus, what is written in the law? How do you read it? And he answered, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. And he said to him, you have answered correctly. Do this and you will live. Now here's a contextual clue that Luke gives us. And he says, but desiring to justify himself. Well, why would this guy, this lawyer, desire to justify himself? Well, maybe because he stands guilty of not doing either the first part or the second part of this, right? Loving God with all your heart, mind, strength, and soul, and love your neighbor as yourself. That's why he's trying to justify himself. And by the question he asks, we know exactly what he's trying to justify himself in. He says, trying to justify himself, he said to Jesus, and who is my neighbor? So clearly what this guy is trying to do, this lawyer who knows the law very well, he knows that there are individuals maybe that he hasn't loved as himself. And so he's trying to justify himself by saying, well, if they're not considered my neighbor, then maybe I'm not required to love them as God's word has told me to love them. And so therefore, he says, who's my neighbor? He's got this question. So Jesus replies, and this is the parable. So we would call this the parable proper, right? Like, so this whole conversation happens before Jesus even gives this parable. That's what I mean when I'm talking about a context, you guys. The context is this conversation with this lawyer, and he tries to justify himself. And then Jesus is now going to communicate a story, and in the story, he's going to answer his question. And here's how the way it goes. It says, Jesus replied, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell among robbers and stripped him and beat him and departed, leaving him half dead. Now by chance, a priest was going down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. So likewise, a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. Now this is important. This is what I mean. You got to know some historical facts, first century stuff. Why would the Levite and the priest pass by this man? Well, because if you actually pay attention to the Old Testament, one of the things you're going to see is that religious folks like these individuals would be contaminated and ritually unclean if they touched a corpse, a dead thing. And so they don't touch him because they think he's dead. He looks dead. He's half dead, right? So he looks dead. He's mostly dead, as in The Princess Bride, for you guys who like that movie. And so they don't touch him. So they don't want to they want to keep their religious obligations to God. They're actually not helping someone in worship of God in their mind, right? So again, the first century understanding in the context is going to give you kind of a richer understanding of this. But if you didn't know first century, like you didn't know that background information, whatever you need to know would be fine. That, hey, these individuals ignored them and passed by. That kind of surface level reading. But again, they have a reason why they actually pass by him. It's not because they just want to be evil and stuff like that. It's because they want to be religious, which maybe makes it even worse than that. And then he says, but a Samaritan, as he journeyed, came to where he was. Again, first century context matters. Samaritans are not very liked by Jews and vice versa. They're kind of seen as traitors because Samaritans are most likely they're Jews that have been that have married Assyrians and various other people groups, and they have different religious practices, and there's issues with them. They're not very liked. They're enemies. There's racism going on here. And so Jesus brings in the group of people that they're most hostile against, right? So it says the Samaritan, as he journeyed, came to where he was, and he saw him, had compassion. He went to him and bound up his wounds, pouring oil and wine. Then he set him on his own animal and brought him to the inn and took care of him. And the next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper. And again, you can look at the how much money a denarii is, and realize that he's giving a substantial amount of money, right? Again, if you don't know that, you just know it as money, you'll just, okay, he paid for him. That's good enough for the interpretive process, but he doesn't just give him money, he gives him a good amount of money. A day's worth of wages, I believe. So, and he gave it to the innkeeper, saying, take care of him, and whatever more you spend, I will repay you when I come back. And then Jesus asks the question. That's it. That's the parable. And then Jesus says, which of these 3 do you think proved to be a neighbor to the man who fell among robbers? Now, if we read this the way Augustine wants us to understand it, this question makes no sense. This is why when you allegorize a text, it loses its original intent. Jesus says, which of these 3 men, Levite, priest, Samaritan, was a neighbor? Because the original question was what? Who is my neighbor? Because the guy's trying to justify himself. So by just asking simple questions of literary context, what's being asked, who's talking, why is this story given, and what's a question that gets asked after the story is given, you realize that the way people allegorize this, specifically, I know we're kind of going at Augustine right now, but the way Augustine interprets this is just bad because it's lost its original meaning completely. It means nothing like what Jesus wanted it to mean, or what he was trying to do, or what happened actually historically, right? And he said, this is the lawyer, the one who showed him mercy. He doesn't even say the Samaritan. That should tell you enough, right? He could literally say, well, the Samaritan, but he doesn't even want to say the Samaritan, maybe because, hey, that's the reason why he's trying to justify himself. Maybe because he doesn't like Samaritans very much. And Jesus puts his finger on exactly what that issue is. And Jesus said to him, you go and do likewise. Be like the Samaritan, is essentially what Jesus is saying. And so there is, again, no need to allegorize this text to understand that this text is takes a situation in which an individual cares for the needs of someone who's hurt, and the people in the story don't really matter. You could replace it with any group of people. As long as you keep the punch of the story being there's a priest, Levite, these are religious individuals, and then there's an enemy of these people. So if you can find direct translations of that in any given context, because you might be telling the story to a group of people that don't know anything about the times of Jesus. But if you say it the way they understand what their religious community is and what are the people that they're at odds with, right, it will make more sense. And you wanted to carry that heaviness, right? You wanted to carry that power punch and say, okay, you got to be like this person who showed mercy. This is a context question. Again, the question is asked in the context. The context is going to tell us how to read it. And then for most of it, you're going to understand it. It's not very complicated. But if you do this, it becomes overcomplicated and you ruin the text. You ruin the meaning of the text. Now, there are stories in which they're allegorical. But the Bible will tell you that they're allegorical, you guys. For example, the story of the seeds when there's 4 seeds that are planted, that are spread. The man takes the sower takes the seed and spreads it, and some fall on rock, and some fall in between the cracks, and some fall on soil that grows with weeds, and some fall on good soil. Jesus goes on to tell us the allegorical meanings. You don't have to invent it. Jesus tells you the seed is the word of God. The birds that come and take it are Satan. And then, the thorns are the troubles of life, and so on and so forth. So the allegory is explained. Sometimes there's allegorical inclusion in there where the original audience know exactly what's going on. So, for example, Jesus gives a parable of a man that builds a vineyard and goes into a far country. If you do your biblical studies and you know what's going on, and the individuals knew exactly what was going on when Jesus was speaking to them, they understood that vineyard represented Israel. And so the story makes a lot more sense when you understand that the vineyard represents Israel. And there doesn't necessarily need to be one-to-one correlations always, but sometimes there are. So in that story, for example, the servants that are sent to collect the rent are the prophets, and then finally he sends his only son, only unique son, the only son he has, and then the tenants kill. And the tenants in that situation are meant to represent the religious leadership. And that's partly why they know exactly what he's saying, and then they get so angry, but they know the people love him and they don't want to kill him. And so they go and they plot to kill him. It's sort of this weird self-fulfilling prophecy that takes place. They hear that they're going to kill him, and then they go plan to kill him. Really strange. So just a couple of notes to wrap this up. Whenever you read a parable, pay close attention to why the story is being told. There's always a reason. There's always a why the story is being told, and it's meant to answer a question. If there is no hints in the text of allegorical usage, do not allegorize the text. Understand that most parables are going to have just one meaning. Try to figure out what that one meaning is. It's not necessary for you to know every single one of the details within a story. I think you can understand it generally, but you should do more study to understand the historical context, therefore understand the text better. I hope that this has just been an introductory kind of sort of thing where you kind of get the excitement of saying, man, I'm going to open up the Gospels and I'm going to read it a bit more carefully this time. And I'm going to pay attention to the questions that are asked and the questions that are answered. And I want to know why this paragraph comes before this other story and why this other story is behind them. There's reasons to all of these things. These are the sorts of things that give me so much excitement to study the Bible, to read it, because it is exciting. You're figuring out these things that you just immediately might not have access to. And then again, when you figure it out, then there's a transformative work, I think, that happens in our lives that God does. And it's just a great blessing, guys. I don't want to go too long on this, but what are questions and comments that you guys might have on this subject, and we'll have a discussion around it. So thanks for watching. God bless you guys. There's the rest of the series on the basics of understanding the Bible. Check it out. I hope you enjoy it, and I'll see you at the next lesson.